Her name is Hilda. She's 60 years old, and her story will forever change the way you see your own marriage. Just 3 days ago, her husband Henry pushed her off a 90-foot cliff to silence her. As she lay there broken and bleeding, her first instinct screamed in her mind, "Pretend I'm dead." But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was realizing that the man she'd loved for 40 years was not just a thief and a liar, but a murderer who had killed their own son to protect his secrets. For 4 decades, Henry and she built what she thought was the perfect family. They woke up every morning in their little suburban home where the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sound of birds singing. She worked as a teacher at the local elementary school, and every afternoon she came home with stories of her young students. Henry had his carpentry shop, where he created the most beautiful furniture you've ever seen. His hands, rough yet delicate, could transform a simple piece of wood into a work of art. They had 2 sons, Richard, their firstborn, and Damien, 5 years younger. Richard was the soul of the house, always laughing, always helping his father in the shop, always shielding her from any worries. Damien was different, more reserved, but she loved him with the same intensity. As a mother, you never play favorites, or at least that's what she thought. On Sundays after church, the whole family would gather around their oak table, which Henry had carved with his own hands. Richard would tell them his plans to study engineering, while Damien would remain silent, just picking at the food on his plate. Life was simple but beautiful. In the evenings, Henry and she would walk the trail around their small town, talking about their dreams, how they'd watch their grandchildren grow, and how they'd grow old together in that very house. She never imagined those walks were training for the one that almost killed her. On weekends, she'd host family gatherings where her sisters, Harriet and Irene, would come with their husbands and children. The house would fill with laughter, kids running everywhere, women sharing recipes in the kitchen while the men fixed something in the yard. Henry was her perfect partner. After 40 years of marriage, he still brought her wild flowers he'd pick on the way to work. He helped her grade her students' tests, and she would hold pieces of wood for him while he cut them in his workshop. They were a team, an unbreakable unit, or so she thought. At night, they'd sit on the porch to watch the stars, planning their future. They talked about traveling when they retired, seeing the ocean for the first time, building a smaller house once their kids started their own families. Henry would describe the little cottage he wanted to build by the lake, complete with a smaller workshop where he could create furniture for their grandchildren. She would talk about the garden she wanted to plant, full of vegetables and flowers, where they could spend their golden years in peaceful contentment. They had subscriptions to travel magazines and would spend hours planning hypothetical trips to Europe, to the mountains, to places they'd never been but dreamed of seeing together. But perfect happiness, as she would discover years later, often hides the deepest tragedies. The very foundation of their beautiful life was built on lies, theft, and ultimately murder. Every loving gesture, every shared dream, every moment of intimacy had been contaminated by Henry's secret life as a criminal and killer. When Richard turned 20, something changed in their family dynamics. He had always been interested in his father's business, but now he began asking pointed questions about the carpentry operations finances. As an engineering student, Richard had a methodical mind and an eye for detail that made him naturally suited to analyzing complex systems. He started studying Henry's invoices and receipts with the thoroughness of an auditor, comparing material costs with project expenses and questioning discrepancies that didn't make sense. "Dad, this invoice for the Morrison kitchen cabinets shows you charged them for premium hardwood, but the receipt from the lumber yard is for standard grade pine," Richard observed one evening, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "That's a difference of nearly $2,000 just on materials. Did you make a mistake on the invoice?" Henry would dismiss Richard's concerns with a patient smile and explanations about business practices that Richard didn't understand yet. He claimed there were legitimate reasons for the discrepancies: rush charges for special orders, delivery fees that weren't itemized separately, quality upgrades that clients requested after the initial estimates were written. "Business isn't as straightforward as engineering," Henry would tell his son. "There are a lot of variables you learn to account for with experience." But Richard's questions became more persistent and more specific. He started keeping his own records, creating spreadsheets that tracked Henry's material purchases against his client invoices. He compared the business's reported income with the lifestyle they were able to maintain, noting inconsistencies that suggested money was coming from sources other than legitimate carpentry work. His engineering training had taught him to look for patterns, to identify where systems weren't functioning as they should, and Henry's business was showing all the signs of a flawed system. "Dad, I've been looking at our insurance claims over the past 5 years," Richard said during one of their Sunday dinners, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. "We filed 17 claims for theft, vandalism, and weather damage to materials and tools. That seems like an unusually high number for a business our size. The insurance company must be starting to flag us as a risk." She remembered seeing a flicker of something cross Henry's face, not confusion or concern, but annoyance. For just a moment, the mask of paternal patience slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. But it was gone so quickly she convinced herself she'd imagined it. "Richard, son, you're overthinking this," Henry said, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "Insurance claims are a normal part of running a business. We work with expensive tools and materials, and unfortunately, theft and damage are occupational hazards." But Richard wasn't satisfied with these explanations. She would hear him talking to his friends on the phone about business ethics, about fiduciary responsibility, about the importance of transparency in client relationships. He had taken a business ethics course as part of his engineering program, and the concepts he was learning were making him look at his father's operation with increasingly critical eyes. One night in October, exactly 25 years ago, Richard didn't come home for dinner. They waited until 11, then 12, then 1 o'clock in the morning. Henry seemed genuinely worried, pacing the house and making phone calls to Richard's friends and study partners. His performance was perfect, the concerned father trying to track down his missing son. When they went out to search for him, Henry organized the effort, dividing up the areas they needed to cover and coordinating with local law enforcement. "He probably just lost track of time studying at the library," Henry said as they drove through the darkness, calling Richard's name. "You know how he gets when he's focused on a project. Remember when he spent all night working on that bridge design and didn't come home until sunrise?" His voice carried just the right note of worry mixed with hopeful rationalization. They searched until dawn, checking every place Richard was known to frequent: the campus library, his favorite study spots, the coffee shop where he met with his engineering group. It was Henry who found the trail that led to the river gorge. Henry who spotted the disturbed earth at the cliff edge that suggested someone had slipped and fallen. "Over here," he called out, his voice breaking with what sounded like devastating realization. I think he fell." They found Richard's body at the bottom of the river gorge, his neck broken from the impact with the rocks below. The police said it was clearly an accident, a young man taking a familiar trail in the dark, perhaps distracted by thoughts of his studies, who had simply misstepped near the edge. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, nothing to suggest anything other than a tragic accident that had claimed a promising young life. Richard's funeral was the darkest day of her life. She wore her only black dress, the same one she'd worn at her mother's funeral years earlier. The entire community came out to mourn with them, filling the church to capacity and spilling out into the parking lot. Henry delivered a eulogy that left not a dry eye in the building, speaking about Richard's dedication to his studies, his love for his family, and his bright future that had been cut tragically short. Richard was the kind of son every father dreams of having, Henry said, his voice breaking with emotion as he stood at the pulpit. He was curious about everything, always asking questions, always trying to understand how things worked and how they could be made better. He challenged me to be a better man, a better father, a better businessman. His loss leaves a hole in our family that can never be filled. The performance was masterful. Henry played the grieving father with such conviction that even she, who knew him better than anyone, was moved by his apparent pain. He held her up when her legs gave out from sobbing, whispered words of comfort when the darkness threatened to overwhelm her, and accepted the condolences of friends and neighbors with the grace of a man bearing unbearable loss with dignity. After the funeral, people spoke about Henry's strength in the face of tragedy, his devotion to his family, his determination to honor Richard's memory by continuing the work his son had been so interested in. "He's being so brave," she heard people whisper. "You can see how much he's hurting, but he's staying strong for Hilda and Damien." What a good man. In the weeks and months that followed Richard's death, Henry seemed to carry the weight of grief heavily. He would spend long hours in his workshop, claiming that work helped him process his emotions and feel connected to the son who had shown such interest in the business. Sometimes she would find him standing motionless among the wood shavings and tools, staring at the workbench where Richard used to help with projects. "I keep expecting him to walk through that door," Henry would tell her, his voice thick with what she believed was genuine sorrow. "I keep thinking I hear his voice asking about material costs or project timelines. He was going to take over the business someday, you know. He had such good ideas about how to modernize our operations, how to serve our clients better." She thought his pain was real because her own pain was so overwhelming that she couldn't imagine anyone being able to fake such emotion. The idea that Henry might be acting, that he might actually be relieved by Richard's death, never crossed her mind because it was simply too monstrous to contemplate. She was grieving the loss of her firstborn, and Henry seemed to be grieving right alongside her. But now, lying at the bottom of this gorge with her ribs broken and blood in her mouth, she understands that Henry's grief was just another performance in a life built on lies and deception. Every tear he shed, every moment of apparent anguish, every word of comfort he offered her during those dark months, all of it was calculated theater designed to cover up the fact that he had murdered their son to protect his criminal enterprise. The years passed, and the wound never fully healed, but they learned to live with it. Damien eventually married Melissa, a sweet girl from the next town over who worked as a nurse at the regional hospital. Their wedding was a bittersweet affair, beautiful but tinged with sadness over Richard's absence. Henry walked Melissa down the aisle in addition to giving away Damien, since her own father had passed away years earlier. "Richard would have loved this day," Henry said in his toast, his voice catching with emotion. "He would have been so proud to see his little brother starting his own family." Damien and Melissa seemed genuinely happy together, and within a few years they had given her 2 beautiful grandchildren, a boy they named Richard in honor of his deceased uncle, and a girl named Sarah, who had her grandmother's eyes and her grandfather's skill with her hands. She finally felt like life was giving them a second chance at happiness after the tragedy that had torn their family apart. Melissa called her mom and always helped with the housework when they visited, insisting that she was too young to be relegated to sitting in the living room while the younger women did all the cooking and cleaning. Damien had inherited Henry's talent for carpentry and worked alongside his father in the family business, though he focused more on the restoration and refinishing side, while Henry handled the custom furniture construction that had made their reputation. Everything seemed perfect again. Family dinners were filled with laughter and the chaos of small children. Holidays were joyous occasions where 3 generations gathered around the same oak table Henry had carved all those years ago. The grandchildren brought new life into the house, their voices and energy filling the spaces that had seemed so empty after Richard's death. But now, lying at the bottom of this gorge with her ribs broken and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, she understands that all that happiness was built on a foundation of lies and murder. Every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every moment of joy they shared was contaminated by the secret Henry carried, the knowledge that he had killed their son to protect his criminal activities. The first signs that something was wrong began 6 months ago when she inherited money from her recently deceased parents. Her father had been a careful saver throughout his life, working as an accountant for a local manufacturing company and investing his modest salary wisely over the decades. Her mother had maintained a life insurance policy that, combined with the sale of their property and the contents of her father's retirement accounts, left her with an inheritance of nearly $100,000. For the first time in their marriage, she wanted to be more involved in managing their financial affairs. They had saved their entire lives, living modestly and putting money away for retirement, and between the house, her inheritance, and their bank savings, they had accumulated nearly $200,000 to leave their children and grandchildren. She wanted to make sure this money was being managed wisely, perhaps invested more aggressively now that they were approaching retirement and needed to plan for their golden years. But Henry seemed uncomfortable with her new interest in their finances, more so than she would have expected from someone who had nothing to hide. "Hilda, sweetheart, you don't need to worry about this stuff," he said when she asked to see their bank statements and investment records. "I've been handling our money for 40 years, and we've done pretty well for ourselves. You should focus on planning for our retirement. Maybe look into those travel packages you're always talking about, or think about what kind of garden you want to plant at the new house." His tone was gentle and loving, the same tone he'd used throughout their marriage when discussing practical matters. But there was something underneath it, a subtle tension that made her uneasy. When she pressed the issue, asking specific questions about where their money was invested and how their retirement accounts were performing, Henry became defensive in a way that was completely unlike him. "Are you saying you don't trust me?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "After 4 decades of marriage, after everything I've provided for this family, you suddenly think I'm hiding something from you?" The way he phrased it made her feel guilty for asking, as if her questions were a betrayal of their marriage vows rather than a reasonable request for information about their joint finances. But something deep in her instincts told her to persist. Perhaps it was her training as a teacher, where she'd learned to spot when students were being evasive about homework or test preparation. Perhaps it was simply the intuition that comes from living with someone for 40 years and knowing when their behavior doesn't quite ring true. Whatever it was, she couldn't shake the feeling that Henry's reluctance to discuss their finances was hiding something more significant than simple pride or old-fashioned ideas about gender roles. She decided to examine their bank statements when Henry was out meeting with a client about a custom dining room set. What she found made her blood run cold. Money that should have been there was missing, not just small amounts that could be explained by forgotten purchases or miscommunication, but significant sums that represented months of careful saving. Large withdrawals that she didn't remember authorizing, made on dates when she'd been at work and unable to question them. There were checks made out to suppliers for amounts that seemed excessive for the materials Henry claimed to have purchased. A bill for $3,000 worth of hardwood that supposedly went into a single kitchen cabinet project. An invoice for $1,500 in specialized tools that she'd never seen in his workshop. Insurance claims for storm damage to their property that she didn't recall their home suffering, resulting in payouts that had apparently been deposited into accounts she didn't know existed. The pattern became clearer the deeper she dug. Henry had been systematically stealing from their joint accounts for years, using her inheritance as the latest source of funding for whatever scheme he was running. But it wasn't just their personal money that was involved. When she looked deeper into the business records Henry kept in his workshop, records she'd never had reason to examine before, she found evidence of a much larger and more sophisticated operation. Henry's carpentry business was essentially a front for an elaborate fraud scheme. He was billing clients for premium materials while using cheaper alternatives, pocketing the difference. He was filing duplicate insurance claims, reporting the same theft or damage to multiple companies, and collecting payouts from each. He was inflating his labor costs, charging clients for work that was never performed or materials that were never used. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over the years, Henry had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from clients who trusted him to provide honest work at fair prices. He had defrauded insurance companies out of tens of thousands in false claims. He had built their comfortable lifestyle on a foundation of systematic theft from people who considered him a friend and trusted craftsman. Her discovery became even more disturbing when she found a hidden lockbox behind a false panel in Henry's workshop, concealed behind a stack of lumber in a corner that casual visitors would never think to examine. Inside were forged documents, duplicate invoices, and bank statements for accounts she didn't know existed. There were detailed records of his fraudulent activities, kept with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to his legitimate carpentry work. But the most devastating find was a letter in Richard's handwriting, dated just 3 days before his death. The paper was worn and creased, as if it had been handled many times over the years, and the ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clearly legible. "Dad, I've been keeping track of the discrepancies in the business accounts for several months now, and I can't ignore what I'm seeing anymore. I know about the inflated invoices to the Morrison family, the Williams kitchen project, and at least 12 other jobs where you charged for materials you never used. I know about the fake insurance claims for the workshop break-in last spring and the storm damage that never happened to our property. I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, tried to find legitimate explanations for what I was seeing, but there aren't any. You've been stealing from people who trust you, people who consider you a friend. Mrs. Henderson is on a fixed income. Did you think about that when you overcharged her by $2,000 for her bathroom renovation? The Johnsons saved for 2 years to afford that custom dining room set. Did you consider what that money meant to them when you billed them for premium wood and used cheap pine instead? This has to stop, Dad. I can't be part of this anymore, and I can't let you keep stealing from people who trust our family. If you don't come clean and make this right, if you don't return the money and confess everything to the clients you've cheated, I'll have to turn you in myself. I can't live with this knowledge and do nothing. I love you, but I can't let you destroy our family's reputation and hurt innocent people just to make extra money we don't even need. Meet me at the old trail tonight at 9 p.m. We need to talk about how you're going to fix this before I'm forced to take it to the authorities. Richard, the horrible truth crashed over her like a wave. Richard hadn't died in an accident. He had discovered his father's crimes, confronted him about them, and Henry had killed him to keep the secret. Her oldest son had died trying to protect their family's honor and the innocent people Henry was stealing from. And Henry had let her grieve for 25 years, comforting her through her darkest moments, accepting condolences for a loss he had caused, never revealing that he was responsible for destroying their family. The letter was dated October 15th. Richard had died on October 18th, exactly 3 days later. 3 days during which Henry had apparently decided that murdering his own son was preferable to facing the consequences of his crimes. 3 days during which he had planned and executed the cold-blooded killing of the young man who should have been his pride and joy. She sat in Henry's workshop, surrounded by the tools and lumber that represented his legitimate skills, holding the letter that revealed the monster hiding behind the facade of the loving husband and devoted father. Every memory of the past 25 years was now contaminated by this knowledge. Every moment of grief they had shared, every conversation about Richard's future that would never be, every anniversary of his death that Henry had helped her through, all of it was a lie designed to cover up the fact that he had murdered their child. The next few days were a nightmare of pretending everything was normal while her world crumbled around her. Henry continued his routine of bringing her flowers, helping her grade papers, and talking about their retirement plans, all while she knew he was a thief and a murderer. She watched his hands as he worked in his shop, the same hands that had created beautiful furniture for their home, that had held her during their wedding dance, that had caressed her skin during 40 years of intimate moments. And now she knew they had also pushed their son to his death. Every interaction became a test of her acting ability. When Henry kissed her good morning, she had to suppress the urge to pull away in revulsion. When he talked about his plans for the day, she had to nod and smile while knowing that those plans likely involved stealing from more innocent clients. When he mentioned Richard's name with apparent fondness, talking about how proud their son would be of the business he was building, she had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming that Richard had died trying to stop him. The psychological torment was almost unbearable. She was living with a man who had murdered their child and was probably planning to murder her as well if she discovered his secret. She was sharing a bed with a killer, eating meals prepared by hands that had committed murder, accepting comfort from someone who was the source of her greatest pain. When she finally worked up the courage to confront Henry with Richard's letter, his transformation was immediate and terrifying. The gentle, loving husband she thought she knew vanished completely, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger whose eyes held no warmth, no recognition of their shared life, no trace of the man she had married. It was as if a mask had been ripped away, revealing the true face of the predator who had been hiding in plain sight for 4 decades. "You should have left well enough alone, Hilda," he said, his voice completely devoid of the warmth and affection she'd known for their entire marriage. Richard couldn't leave well enough alone either, and look what happened to him. The casual way he admitted to murdering their son, as if it were a minor business decision rather than the destruction of their family, chilled her to the bone. His demeanor was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made his words more terrifying than anger would have been. This wasn't a confession born of guilt or remorse. This was the matter-of-fact admission of a man who had been living a lie so long that the truth felt like a minor inconvenience. "How could you?" she whispered, backing away from him in their own kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd shared thousands of meals, where Richard had done his homework as a boy. "How could you kill our son?" Henry's response revealed the depth of his selfishness and the complete absence of any paternal love. He was going to destroy everything I'd worked for. The business, our reputation, our financial security. He said he was going to turn me in to the police, ruin me over some inflated invoices and insurance claims. Very noble, your son. Very righteous, but also very stupid. The way he said, your son, as if Richard had never belonged to him, as if the young man's sense of ethics was somehow a character flaw rather than a virtue, made her sick to her stomach. This was how Henry viewed their firstborn, not as a beloved child, but as an obstacle to his criminal enterprise, a problem that had needed to be eliminated. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed for this family? Henry continued, his voice rising slightly as he worked himself into what seemed like genuine indignation. Do you think our comfortable lifestyle just happened by accident? The nice house, the family vacations, the money for Richard's college education. Where do you think that came from? My carpentry skills alone wouldn't have provided half of what we've enjoyed over the years. The realization that Henry actually believed he was justified in his crimes was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his confession. In his mind, he wasn't a thief and a murderer. He was a provider who had done whatever was necessary to give his family a good life. The fact that this good life was built on the suffering of others, funded by theft from people who trusted him, apparently didn't factor into his moral calculations. Richard couldn't understand that sometimes you have to make difficult choices to protect what matters most, Henry said, moving closer to her in their kitchen. He was young, idealistic, naive about how the world really works. He thought everything was black and white, right and wrong, with no room for the gray areas that adults have to navigate. The way Henry spoke about their son's moral convictions as if they were childish naivety rather than admirable principles made her realize just how fundamentally different their values had always been. She had thought they shared the same ethical foundation, the same commitment to honesty and integrity, but apparently Henry had been operating from a completely different moral framework throughout their entire marriage. What about now? She asked, though she already knew the answer from the cold calculation in his eyes. What happens to me now that I know the truth? The question hung in the air between them, and she could see Henry weighing his options, considering the various ways he could solve this new problem that had emerged in his carefully constructed life. You know, Hilda, Henry said, his tone becoming almost gentle again, though the warmth never reached his eyes. We never did take that anniversary trip to the mountains you've always wanted. I think it's time we celebrated 40 years of marriage properly. Just the two of us, like when we were young. I know the perfect spot. Very private, very romantic, with spectacular views. You'll love it. The way he said spectacular views made her blood freeze in her veins. She understood immediately that she was now in the same position Richard had been in 25 years ago, a problem that needed to be eliminated to protect Henry's secrets. The loving husband who had shared her bed for 4 decades was calmly planning her murder, and he was already working out the details of how to make it look like an accident. The next few days were a surreal nightmare of pretense and preparation. Henry acted like the loving husband planning a romantic getaway, but she could see the calculation behind every action. He researched hiking trails obsessively, spending hours on the computer looking at topographical maps and reading reviews of various scenic overlooks. But his focus was exclusively on remote areas with dangerous cliff edges, places where an accident could easily occur without witnesses. He bought new hiking equipment with the enthusiasm of someone planning a genuine adventure. New boots, weather-resistant clothing, a high-end GPS device, emergency supplies. But she noticed that his purchases were focused on items that would support his cover story rather than ensuring their actual safety. He bought a camera to document their romantic getaway, rope that he claimed was for emergency situations, and a first aid kit that seemed more appropriate for treating injuries than preventing them. She watched him practice his story in the bathroom mirror when he thought she was asleep, perfecting the tone of devastated grief he would need to convince rescuers and police that her death was a tragic accident. She slipped right out of my hands, he would whisper to his reflection, his voice breaking with manufactured emotion. I tried to grab her, but it happened so fast. 1 minute we were taking pictures, and the next she was falling. I couldn't save her. The performance was chilling in its sophistication. Henry had clearly learned from his experience with Richard's murder, refining his technique and eliminating the small inconsistencies that might have raised suspicions if anyone had been looking closely enough. This time, there would be hiking gear to suggest they were experienced outdoor enthusiasts, photographs to document their romantic trip and physical evidence of his attempts to rescue her. During their last few evenings together, Henry was more attentive than he'd been in years, bringing her flowers, cooking her favorite meals, and talking fondly about their shared memories. To anyone observing them, they would have seemed like a couple deeply in love, celebrating their long marriage with a romantic adventure. But she could see the calculation behind his gestures, the way he was building a narrative of devoted love that would make her accidental death seem even more tragic. "Do you remember our first hiking trip together?" he asked over dinner, holding her hand across the table with the same gentle touch she'd known for decades. "You were so scared of the heights, but you trusted me to keep you safe. You said you'd follow me anywhere as long as I was holding your hand." The irony of his words was lost on him, but not on her. She had trusted him completely for 40 years, and that trust was exactly what had made her so vulnerable to his betrayal. She considered running, calling the police, or telling her sister Harriet what she'd discovered. But she had no concrete proof beyond Richard's letter, which Henry could claim was a forgery created by a son who was confused about normal business practices. The business records could be explained away as legitimate expenses that she simply didn't understand because she lacked experience in the construction industry. Without Richard alive to testify about what he'd discovered, it would be her word against that of a respected businessman with 40 years of community reputation behind him. More terrifyingly, she realized that if she tried to expose Henry and failed, her death would become an immediate necessity rather than just a convenience. He would have to act quickly, and a hiking accident would look much more suspicious if it happened right after she'd accused him of murder. Her best chance of survival was to play along with his plan while looking for an opportunity to escape or gather evidence that could expose him. The morning of their anniversary hike arrived with cruel irony. The weather was perfect, sunny skies, comfortable temperatures, light winds that would make for ideal hiking conditions. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful day for a romantic adventure, the kind of anniversary celebration that couples dream about during their golden years. Instead, it felt like a mockery of everything their marriage should have represented. Henry was cheerful over breakfast, chatting enthusiastically about the romantic spot he'd chosen for their picnic lunch. He showed her pictures on his phone of the scenic overlook they would visit, a dramatic cliff edge with panoramic views of the valley below. "It's going to be perfect, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine excitement. "Just you and me, celebrating 4 decades of love in one of the most beautiful places in the state. I've planned something very special." His words sounded like a death sentence delivered with a smile. She forced herself to eat breakfast and respond to his conversation, playing the role of the excited wife embarking on a romantic adventure with her devoted husband. But every bite of food tasted like ash, and every word felt like it might be among her last. Henry showed her the route on a topographical map, pointing out the various landmarks they would pass on their way to what he called the perfect spot for photographs. His finger traced the trail to a cliff edge that was marked with warnings about dangerous conditions and unstable rock formations. "The guidebook says the view from up there is supposed to be breathtaking," he said, and she realized he meant that quite literally. He loaded their car with hiking gear and picnic supplies, playing the role of the thoughtful husband who had planned every detail of their special day. But she noticed that his emergency supplies included rope and climbing gear that seemed excessive for a simple day hike to a scenic overlook. When she asked about it, he explained that he wanted to be prepared for any situation, that he'd rather have equipment they didn't need than need equipment they didn't have. During the 2-hour drive to the mountains, Henry maintained his performance as the devoted husband celebrating their anniversary. He played her favorite music, stopped to buy her flowers from a roadside stand, and talked lovingly about their early years together. "Do you remember when we first started dating, and I took you on that picnic by the lake?" he asked, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "You said it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for you. I've been trying to top that day ever since." But she could see his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly during emotional moments, could hear the forced quality in his laughter when she made nervous jokes about her fear of heights. This man she'd shared a bed with for 4 decades, who knew every inch of her body, every fear and dream and secret, was driving her to her execution while discussing their grandchildren's college funds and their plans for retirement. When they reached the trailhead, the isolation hit her immediately. There were no other cars in the small gravel parking area, no other hikers visible on the trails, no witnesses to whatever Henry had planned. The remoteness that would have seemed romantic under other circumstances now felt like a trap closing around her. Perfect, Henry said, surveying the empty landscape with satisfaction. We'll have complete privacy for our celebration. He shouldered his backpack and helped her adjust her hiking gear, fussing over her like a concerned husband, making sure his wife was comfortable for their adventure. But she could feel the tension in his touch, the barely contained energy of a predator preparing to strike. Are you sure you're feeling up to this? He asked with mock concern. I know you've been worried about the altitude and the steep sections. The trail was more difficult than Henry had described to her, though she suspected he'd scouted it previously to ensure it would exhaust her and make her more vulnerable. It wound up steep rocky paths that left her winded and struggling, making her more dependent on his help and less able to resist when the crucial moment came. Don't worry, Henry said, supporting her arm with the same hands that had murdered their son. The climb is worth it. The view from the top is something you'll never forget. His words carried a double meaning that chilled her blood. She would indeed never forget the view, because she wasn't supposed to survive to see anything else after today. Every step took them farther from civilization, farther from help, closer to the remote spot Henry had chosen for her murder. She tried to memorize landmarks along the way, anything that might help search teams find her body, assuming Henry even reported her missing rather than claiming she'd left him for another man or simply disappeared. As they climbed higher, the trail became more treacherous, with loose rocks and steep drop-offs that would make an accidental fall seem entirely plausible. Henry pointed out the dangerous sections with the concern of a loving husband worried about his wife's safety, but she could see him cataloging them as potential murder sites, calculating which location would provide the most convincing accident scene. After an hour of climbing, her legs were shaking from exertion and her breathing was labored. Henry, meanwhile, seemed energized by their progress, his step becoming lighter and his demeanor more animated the closer they got to his goal. Almost there, he announced as they rounded a bend and saw the cliff edge ahead, just a little bit farther to the overlook. The lookout he had chosen was a narrow, rocky promontory extending out over a valley, with a 90-foot drop to jagged rocks below. The view was indeed spectacular, rolling hills covered in autumn foliage, a meandering river catching the sunlight, distant mountains purple against the horizon. Under different circumstances, it would have been a breathtaking spot for a romantic picnic, the kind of place where couples renew their wedding vows or celebrate milestone anniversaries. But all she could think about was how perfect this place was for murder. It was remote enough that her screams wouldn't be heard, dangerous enough that an accidental fall would seem entirely plausible, and isolated enough that there would be no witnesses to contradict Henry's version of events. The drop was far enough to ensure that she wouldn't survive to tell the truth about what really happened. Come stand over here, Henry said, positioning himself between her and the safe path back down the mountain. I want to get some photos of you with the valley in the background. These will be pictures we treasure forever. The irony of his words was lost on him, but not on her. These would indeed be the last photos ever taken of her, if Henry even bothered to take any before pushing her over the edge. As she moved toward the cliff edge, she watched Henry's face carefully and saw the exact moment his mask finally fell away. The loving expression disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a killer preparing to strike. His body language changed subtly, shifting from supportive husband to predator cornering his prey. You know, Hilda, he said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. Richard stood right here 25 years ago, right on this exact spot. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just any remote cliff. This was the actual place where Henry had murdered their son. He had brought her here deliberately, not just to kill her, but to complete some twisted symmetry by murdering his family members in the same location where he destroyed their firstborn. He fought me at first, Henry continued, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. Kept talking about right and wrong, about how he couldn't let me keep stealing from people who trusted me. Very noble, your son. Very idealistic, but also very naive about how the world really works. The casual way he discussed Richard's final moments made her stomach turn with revulsion. He said he was going to turn me in the next day if I didn't confess everything myself, Henry went on, stepping closer to her as he spoke. Can you imagine? After everything I'd provided for him, everything I'd sacrificed to give him opportunities one never had, he was going to destroy me over some inflated invoices and insurance claims. So I did what I had to do, just like I'm about to do now. In that moment, as Henry stepped toward her with his arms outstretched, she saw not her husband of 40 years, but the monster who had been hiding behind his face all this time. The hands reaching for her were the same hands that had stroked her hair during their wedding dance, that had held her during childbirth, that had wiped away her tears at their son's funeral, tears shed for a death he had caused. Time seemed to slow as Henry lunged forward, his face twisted with a mixture of determination and something that might have been regret. She felt his hands hit her chest with brutal force, felt her feet lose contact with solid ground, felt the sickening sensation of falling through empty air with nothing but jagged rocks waiting 90 feet below. Hilda! Oh God, no! Hilda! She heard Henry's voice calling out as she fell, his performance as the devastated husband already beginning before she'd even hit the ground. The wind rushed past her ears, drowning out his words as the rocky ground rushed up to meet her with terrifying speed. The impact was devastating. She hit the rocks with a sickening crunch that echoed through the gorge, feeling bones snap and her body crumple against the unforgiving stone. Pain exploded through every fiber of her being, her right arm bending at an impossible angle, her ribs screaming with each attempt to breathe, blood streaming down her face from a deep gash on her forehead that had opened when her skull struck the rocks. Her left leg was twisted beneath her at an angle that suggested multiple fractures, and she could feel something warm and sticky soaking through her hiking clothes where internal injuries were bleeding into her abdominal cavity. Her shoulder felt separated from the joint, sending lightning bolts of agony through her torso every time she tried to move. The taste of blood filled her mouth, and she could feel it running from her nose and ears. But through the overwhelming physical agony, one thought burned clear and bright in her mind. Pretend I'm dead. It wasn't conscious strategy so much as pure survival instinct, the same instinct that had kept humans alive through millennia of predators and threats. With willpower she didn't know she possessed, she forced herself to remain completely motionless, controlling even her breathing to make it imperceptible to anyone who might be watching from above. Above her, she could hear Henry's voice calling out with perfect anguish. Hilda, sweetheart, can you hear me? Oh God, please be okay. His performance as the devastated husband had already begun, and it was masterful. Anyone listening would hear the voice of a man whose world had just collapsed, whose beloved wife had just fallen to her death in a tragic accident during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary celebration. She heard him beginning his descent, his boots scraping against rock as he made his way down the treacherous cliff face to where she lay broken among the stones. Every footstep brought him closer, and she had to fight the overwhelming urge to move, to cry out, to beg for help. But she knew that revealing she was alive would only result in Henry finishing what he'd started, probably by claiming she'd been delirious from her injuries and had accidentally fallen again while he was trying to help her. Oh, sweetheart, Henry whispered as he knelt beside her broken body, his voice perfectly modulated with grief and shock. I tried to grab you, but you slipped right through my fingers. The rock must have given way under your foot. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But even through her closed eyelids, even in her semi-conscious state, she could detect something else in his voice, relief. It was the relief of a man whose problems had just been solved, whose secrets were now safe forever, whose financial crimes would never be exposed because the only witness was lying dead at the bottom of a cliff. Henry had spent 25 years living with the fear that someday someone would discover what he'd done to Richard, and now that fear was gone along with the person who had threatened to expose him. Henry checked for her pulse with hands that trembled, not from grief, but from adrenaline and the stress of maintaining his performance while processing the magnitude of what he'd just accomplished. She had to fight every survival instinct to keep her breathing shallow enough that he couldn't detect it, to keep her heart rate low enough that her pulse seemed absent. It was the performance of her own lifetime, with death as the penalty for a poor review. She felt his fingers probing for a pulse at her wrist, then at her neck, pressing against the carotid artery while he counted silently. She had to concentrate on keeping her heartbeat as slow and weak as possible, barely perceptible even to someone actively searching for it. The pain from her injuries actually helped with this deception, as shock and blood loss were naturally slowing her vital signs to dangerously low levels. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she heard Henry moving away, pulling out his cell phone to call for help. The sound of his voice as he contacted emergency services was a masterclass in grief-stricken desperation, perfectly calibrated to generate sympathy rather than suspicion. 911. This is Henry Miller. I need help immediately. My wife, she fell from Eagle Peak Trail. We were hiking for our anniversary, and she slipped near the cliff edge. I tried to catch her, but she fell so far. She's not responding. She's not breathing. Please send help immediately. His voice broke with what anyone else would interpret as devastating grief, but she recognized it as the performance of a lifetime. He gave precise directions to their location, described her condition with medical accuracy that suggested he'd prepared for this call, and provided a timeline of events that painted him as the tragic widower rather than the calculating murderer he actually was. We were taking pictures near the edge, he told the dispatcher, his voice shaking with what sounded like trauma. She stepped back to get a better angle of me with the mountains, and the rock gave way under her foot. I lunged forward to grab her, but she fell so fast. I heard her hit the rocks, and then silence. As they waited for rescue teams to arrive, Henry maintained his vigil beside her body, occasionally speaking to her in loving tones for the benefit of any rescue workers who might be approaching within earshot. Hold on, sweetheart. Help is coming. Just hold on for me, he would say in a voice thick with apparent emotion. But when he thought no one could hear, his tone changed completely. It's finally over, she heard him whisper as he crouched beside her broken form. After 25 years of looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone would figure out what happened to Richard, it's finally over. No more questions, no more investigations, no more threats. Just peace. And with the insurance money, I can pay off my debts and start fresh somewhere new. The casual way he spoke about monetizing her death, about the practical benefits of murdering his wife, revealed the true depth of his monstrosity. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a coldly calculated business decision, the elimination of a liability that had threatened his criminal enterprise. She wasn't his beloved wife of 40 years. She was simply a problem that had been solved with characteristic efficiency. The rescue teams arrived with professional competence, rappelling down the cliff face with medical equipment and stretchers. She heard them working around her, checking vital signs with portable monitors, discussing her condition in medical terminology that she didn't fully understand, but that sounded appropriately grave. This one's in bad shape, she heard the lead paramedic say to his partner. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding, significant head trauma. If she's still alive, it's barely. We need to move fast, but we also need to be careful not to cause additional damage during extraction. They secured her to a backboard with practiced efficiency, immobilizing her neck and spine before beginning the dangerous process of lifting her up the cliff face to the waiting ambulance. Throughout the entire rescue operation, Henry maintained his performance as the devastated husband, answering questions about what had happened while staying close enough to monitor whether she showed any signs of consciousness. We've been married for 40 years, he told the rescue team leader, his voice heavy with what sounded like profound grief. We came up here to celebrate our anniversary, to see the mountains she'd always talked about visiting. She was so excited this morning, talking about how romantic it was going to be. I never imagined. I just keep thinking I should have been more careful, should have insisted we stay further from the edge. His performance was so convincing that even the hardened rescue professionals spoke about him with sympathy and admiration. Poor guy, she heard one of them comment to another. You can see how much he loves her. Look how he's holding her hand, talking to her even though she probably can't hear him. That's real devotion. If only they knew that his devotion was actually the careful monitoring of a killer making sure his victim stayed unconscious, that his tender words were just part of an elaborate performance designed to cover up the fact that he'd just committed murder. His vigil beside her stretcher wasn't motivated by love, but by the need to ensure she never woke up to tell the truth about what had really happened on that cliff. During the helicopter flight to the regional trauma center, she maintained her deception while paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her condition for the flight. She heard them discussing her injuries, her vital signs, her chances of survival. Information that Henry absorbed with the intensity of a man whose future depended on the outcome. Blood pressure is dropping, one of the paramedics reported. We're losing her. Increase the flow and prep the crash cart. She felt them working over her, checking her breathing, monitoring her heart rate, doing everything they could to keep her alive. Meanwhile, Henry sat in the jump seat beside her stretcher, holding her hand and murmuring words of encouragement that were really hopes for her death. If she died during the flight, he would be a free man with access to their joint assets and no one left to expose his crimes. If she survived but remained unconscious or brain damaged, she couldn't testify against him and might even require expensive long-term care that would justify him accessing her insurance money. Only if she recovered fully would he face exposure and the need to eliminate her more directly. At the hospital, the chaos of a trauma response surrounded her as she was rushed into emergency surgery. Doctors worked to repair her broken bones, stop internal bleeding, and address the head injury that had rendered her unconscious. She heard them discussing her condition in clinical terms that painted a grim picture of her prospects for recovery. Multiple rib fractures with possible pneumothorax, one doctor reported to another. Compound fracture of the left femur, displaced fracture of the right radius, possible spleen laceration causing internal bleeding. The head injury is the biggest concern. Significant contusion with swelling that could result in permanent brain damage even if she survives. While medical teams fought to save her life, Henry waited in the family area, accepting condolences from friends and neighbors who had heard about the accident. He gave tearful interviews to local reporters about their beautiful marriage and the tragic turn their anniversary celebration had taken. His performance so convincing that even people who had known them for decades were moved by his apparent grief. 40 years of marriage, she heard him tell a reporter through the thin walls of her recovery room. We were so happy, so much in love. She wanted to see the mountains for our anniversary, and I thought it would be a perfect romantic getaway. I never imagined it would end like this. I just keep thinking I should have been more careful, should have insisted we stay further from the edge. His voice carried exactly the right note of guilt and regret, the natural self-recrimination of a husband who blamed himself for not preventing his wife's accident. If I could trade places with her, I would in a heartbeat, he continued, his voice breaking with manufactured emotion. She's the love of my life, my best friend, my everything. I don't know how I'll go on without her. The performance was so convincing that even the medical staff spoke about him with admiration. Such a devoted husband, she heard a nurse comment to another. He hasn't left her side since they brought her in. You can see how much he loves her. It's rare to see that kind of dedication in couples who've been married as long as they have. If only they knew that his vigil was motivated not by love, but by the need to ensure she never woke up to tell the truth, that his constant presence at her bedside was actually the watch of a killer, making sure his victim stayed silent. Every word of love, every gesture of devotion, every tear he shed was part of an elaborate performance designed to cover up the fact that he had just attempted to murder his wife to cover up his crimes. Over the following days, as her body slowly healed from the massive trauma, she maintained her unconscious facade while listening to Henry's conversations with doctors, lawyers, and insurance agents. He had already begun the process of settling her affairs, discussing her will and the distribution of assets with the family attorney they'd used for decades. Of course, I hope and pray she recovers completely, he told the lawyer during a conversation she overheard through the thin hospital room door. But the doctors are saying that even if she survives, there could be significant brain damage. We need to be realistic about the possibilities and make sure all the legal paperwork is in order. She heard him meeting with insurance representatives, filing claims for her medical expenses while simultaneously preparing for what he euphemistically called the worst-case scenario. He had contacted their life insurance company to get information about the claims process, just in case, and had begun reaching out to her family members to prepare them for the possibility that she might not make it through this. The efficiency with which he was handling the practical aspects of her potential death was chilling. Within 48 hours of her accident, Henry had already met with their financial advisor to discuss how to access her inheritance if she died, had spoken with a real estate agent about the potential sale of their house, and had researched funeral homes to get information, just in case the worst happens. But the most disturbing conversations were the ones he had when he thought he was alone with her unconscious form. Late at night, when the hospital corridors were quiet and the nursing staff was busy with other patients, Henry would pull his chair close to her bed and speak in whispers that revealed his true feelings about their situation. "I know you can't hear me, Hilda," he would murmur, holding her hand with the same gentle touch she'd known for decades. "But I want you to know that I never wanted it to come to this. You forced my hand, just like Richard did. You couldn't leave well enough alone. You had to keep digging, keep asking questions about things that were none of your business." His words confirmed what she already knew, that her husband was a man capable of murdering his own family to protect his secrets, a man who could sit by her hospital bed and speak of love while hoping for her death. The Henry she had married, the father she thought had raised their children, the partner she had trusted with her life, that man had either never existed or had died long ago, replaced by this cold-blooded killer who wore his face. "I provided for this family for 40 years, Henry continued during one of these bedside confessions. "I gave you everything you ever wanted, a beautiful home, financial security, wonderful vacations, the best of everything. And how do you repay me? By snooping through my business records, by questioning my methods, by threatening to destroy everything I've built." The sense of entitlement in his voice was staggering. In Henry's mind, his theft and fraud were justified because they had funded the comfortable lifestyle she had enjoyed. The fact that this comfort had come at the expense of innocent people who trusted him, that it was built on a foundation of crime and murder, apparently didn't factor into his moral calculations at all. During her second week in the hospital, she overheard a phone conversation that made her blood run cold despite her injuries. Henry was speaking with someone he called Tony, discussing what sounded like a debt collection arrangement in terms that suggested this was not a legitimate business relationship. "The insurance money should come through within 6 weeks, Henry was saying in a low voice, clearly trying not to be overheard by medical staff. $200,000 from her life insurance policy, plus another $150 from the accidental death benefit. I can have your money by the end of next month, with the agreed-upon interest." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Henry didn't just owe money to banks and suppliers. He owed money to dangerous people, the kind who didn't accept excuses or payment plans, who viewed debt collection as a matter of reputation and survival. Her death wasn't just convenient for covering up his crimes. It was absolutely necessary for his own survival. "No, there won't be any problems with the payout," Henry continued, his voice taking on a note of confidence that chilled her. "It was clearly an accidental death. I have witnesses, the rescue team, the doctors, the police who investigated the scene. My wife slipped and fell while we were taking anniversary photos. Tragic accident, no question about it." She realized that if Henry couldn't pay these people back, he would be the next one to have a fatal accident. Her murder wasn't just about covering up his financial crimes. It was about accessing the life insurance money he needed to stay alive himself. He had calculated that her death would solve multiple problems simultaneously, eliminating the witness to his crimes, providing the funds to pay off his dangerous creditors, and maintaining his reputation as a grieving widower rather than a suspected criminal. But she was alive, and as her strength slowly returned over the following days, she began to plan her revenge. Henry had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He had believed his own performance so completely that he never considered she might survive to expose him. He spent his days playing the grieving husband while secretly planning how to spend her life insurance money, never realizing that his final victim was watching and listening to everything. Her opportunity came when a young nurse named Sarah began spending extra time in her room during night shifts. Sarah had noticed inconsistencies in her condition that didn't quite match the clinical picture of someone in a deep coma. Vital signs that were stronger than they should be, subtle movements that suggested consciousness despite the lack of response to standard neurological tests. "I don't know if you can hear me," Sarah whispered during one of her late-night checks, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. "But something doesn't feel right about your situation. Your husband seems very concerned about your condition, but there's something about the way he asks questions that bothers me. If you're in there, if you can understand me, try to move your finger." Very slowly, fighting through the pain of her injuries and the fog of pain medication, she managed to move her index finger slightly. It was the smallest possible movement, barely perceptible even to someone looking for it, but Sarah noticed immediately. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, leaning closer to the bed. "You're conscious, aren't you? You've been awake this whole time." She moved her finger again, slightly more noticeably this time, confirming Sarah's suspicion. "Listen to me very carefully," Sarah said, her voice urgent but quiet to avoid attracting attention from other staff members. "If someone hurt you, if this wasn't really an accident, move your finger twice." Without hesitation, she moved her finger twice, as clearly as she could manage given her physical limitations. Sarah's eyes widened with a mixture of horror and determination. "I'm going to help you," she promised. "But we have to be very careful. If whoever did this thinks you can identify them, you're in even more danger than you were before." Over the next several nights, working only during Sarah's shifts when they could be sure of privacy, they developed a communication system using finger movements and eye blinks. Slowly, painstakingly, she was able to convey the basic facts. Her husband had pushed her off the cliff. He had killed their son 25 years ago to cover up financial crimes, and he was planning to kill her again if she survived and recovered her memory. Sarah listened with growing horror as the full scope of Henry's crimes became clear. "We need evidence," Sarah said during one of their clandestine conversations. "Your word alone might not be enough, especially since he's built up so much sympathy as the grieving husband. Half the hospital staff thinks he's a saint for staying by your side through this ordeal." The plan they developed was dangerous but necessary. Sarah would hide a recording device in the room and then create an opportunity for Henry to be alone with her while believing she was beginning to regain consciousness. If he thought she might recover her memory and expose him, he would be forced to act, and they would have evidence of his murderous intent captured on tape. "It's risky," Sarah admitted as they finalized their plan. "If he realizes what we're doing, or if he decides to hurt you before we can get help, there might not be time to save you. But it's probably our only chance to get the kind of evidence that will convince the police to investigate his story about your accident." The trap was set on a quiet Tuesday night when Sarah had arranged for the other nurses to be busy elsewhere in the hospital wing. She activated the hidden recording device, then made a show of checking her patient's condition while speaking loudly enough for Henry to hear from the hallway where he'd been maintaining his vigil. "Doctor, you need to see this," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had just witnessed a significant medical development. "I think she's starting to wake up. Her vital signs are getting stronger, and I swear her eyes were tracking my movements earlier. She even seemed to respond to voice commands." She heard Henry's sharp intake of breath from the hallway, followed by the sound of his chair scraping against the floor as he stood up quickly. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice tight with what anyone else would interpret as hope, but which she recognized as alarm. "Her condition has improved dramatically over the past few hours," Sarah continued, maintaining her performance for the recording device. "I think she might be emerging from the coma. I'm going to call Dr. Patterson right away to examine her. This could be the breakthrough we've been hoping for." Sarah left the room with a great show of urgency, claiming she needed to call the attending physician immediately to report the improvement in her patient's condition. As soon as they were alone, Henry's demeanor changed completely. The loving husband disappeared, replaced by the cold killer she had glimpsed on that mountain cliff. "So," he said quietly, moving closer to her bed with predatory focus, "the doctors think you might be waking up. That's problematic." His voice carried none of the warmth or relief that a loving husband should feel upon hearing that his wife might recover from her injuries. His hand moved to the oxygen mask covering her face, his fingers tracing the edges of the equipment as if calculating how easy it would be to cut off her air supply without triggering the monitoring alarms. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes coma patients take a turn for the worse just when it looks like they're improving. Complications from their injuries, problems with their breathing, blood clots that travel to the brain. Very sad, very tragic, but these things happen in hospitals all the time." The recording device captured every word as Henry continued his monologue, revealing details about Richard's murder that only the killer could know. "Richard thought he was so smart, keeping records of what he called my business irregularities. But he didn't understand that I was building something lasting, creating opportunities for our family that my carpentry skills alone never could have provided." His hand moved from the oxygen mask to her throat, feeling for her pulse while applying subtle pressure to her windpipe. You made the same mistake he did, Henry continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. You couldn't trust me to handle things my own way. Couldn't believe that everything I did was for our family's benefit. You had to play detective, had to dig through records that were none of your business. The pressure on her throat increased slightly, not enough to trigger the monitoring equipment, but enough to make breathing more difficult. Richard stood right there on that cliff, accusing me of being a thief, threatening to turn me in to the police like I was some common criminal. After everything I'd given him, every opportunity I'd provided, he was going to destroy me over some inflated invoices and insurance claims. Henry's grip tightened as he spoke, his fingers finding the exact pressure points that would cut off blood flow to her brain without leaving obvious marks. Do you know what it's like to realize that your own son sees you as a criminal? To have the child you've sacrificed everything for look at you with disgust and moral superiority? He called me a thief, Hilda. My own son called me a thief. But before Henry could escalate from threats to action, Sarah returned with 2 security guards and a police detective who had been waiting in the hallway, having heard enough of Henry's confession through the door to understand the danger their patient was in. Step away from the patient, sir, Detective Johnson ordered, his hand resting on his service weapon as he entered the room. Henry Miller, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of your wife and the murder of your son, Richard Miller. The look of shock and rage on Henry's face as he realized he'd been trapped was something she would remember for the rest of her life. In that moment, the mask fell away completely, revealing the true face of the man she had been married to for 4 decades. All pretense of love, grief, or even basic humanity vanished, replaced by the cold fury of a predator who had been outmaneuvered by his intended prey. You conniving bitch, he snarled, lunging toward her bed before the security guards restrained him. You lying, manipulative bitch. I should have finished you off on that mountain instead of trusting gravity to do the job. You were supposed to die, just like Richard died. You were supposed to keep your mouth shut and stop causing problems. His words, captured clearly on the recording device, provided the final piece of evidence needed to ensure his conviction. The mask of the grieving husband had been completely stripped away, revealing the monster who had been hiding behind it for 25 years. I gave you everything, he screamed as the guards dragged him from the room. I built a life for us, provided for our family, and this is how you repay me? By destroying everything I worked for? Within hours of Henry's arrest, police had obtained warrants to search their home and his workshop, where they found the hidden cache of forged documents, Richard's letter, and evidence of decades of financial fraud. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of his crimes. Hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from clients over the years, fraudulent insurance claims dating back more than 2 decades, and a pattern of escalating theft that had culminated in murder when his son threatened to expose him. The trial became a media sensation, with reporters from across the country covering the story of the devoted husband who had murdered his own son and attempted to kill his wife to cover up his crimes. Henry's defense attorney tried to portray him as a man driven to desperation by financial pressure and the fear of losing everything he'd worked for, but the recording of his attempted murder in the hospital room, combined with Richard's letter and the extensive physical evidence, made his guilt undeniable. During her testimony, she faced Henry across the courtroom for the first time since that day on the mountain. He showed no remorse, no recognition of the decades of love and trust he had betrayed. Instead, his expression was one of cold calculation mixed with bitter resentment, as if he were still looking for an angle, still searching for a way to escape the consequences of his actions. Henry Miller, she said when given the opportunity to address him directly during the victim impact portion of the trial. I don't know who you are. The man I married, the father of my children, the partner I trusted with my life. That person either never existed or died long ago. What's sitting in that defendant's chair is a stranger who wore my husband's face while planning the murder of our family. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Henry guilty on all charges. First-degree murder in Richard's death, attempted murder for pushing her off the cliff, and multiple counts of fraud, theft, and racketeering related to his business crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to hurt the people who trusted him. In the year that followed the trial, she slowly rebuilt her life and her sense of identity. The physical injuries from the fall healed relatively quickly with proper medical care and physical therapy. But the emotional trauma of discovering that her entire marriage had been built on lies took much longer to process. She sold the house where Henry had murdered their son's investigation into his crimes, where he had planned her own death while they shared breakfast and discussed their retirement dreams. Damien and his family had been devastated by the revelations about his father. "I never knew," he told her through tears during one of their first conversations after the trial. "All those years, I thought Dad was just a successful businessman, maybe a little competitive, but basically honest. I never imagined he was capable of murder, especially not of Richard. How do I explain to my children that their grandfather killed their uncle?" The family that remained was small but genuine, bound together by their shared loss and their determination to honor Richard's memory with the truth he had died trying to reveal. They established a scholarship fund in Richard's name for students studying engineering ethics, ensuring that his commitment to doing the right thing would inspire future generations to stand up against corruption and fraud. She also became an advocate for domestic violence survivors, particularly those whose abuse came not from passionate anger, but from the cold calculation of predators who wore the faces of loving partners. Her story became a powerful example of how evil can hide behind the most familiar faces, how the people we trust most completely can sometimes be the greatest threats to our safety. Sometimes, late at night in her new apartment, she would think about those seconds of falling from the cliff, when her survival instinct had screamed at her to pretend to be dead. That instinct had saved her life and brought justice for her son, but it had also taught her a terrible truth about the capacity for evil that can hide behind the most convincing masks of love and devotion. The perfect husband, the respected craftsman, the grieving father, the devoted widower, all roles played by a monster who had fooled everyone, including himself, for decades. But she had survived, she had remembered, and she had ensured that the truth finally came to light after 25 years of darkness. Her first instinct to play dead had been the beginning of Henry's end, and in that small victory, she found the strength to build a new life on the foundation of truth rather than the quicksand of lies that had nearly consumed her family.